Hi everyone, the Partial Prophet here. Thanks for tuning in. So I wanted to remind you that we know in part and we prophesy in part, and then when Jesus comes, we will see fully. Okay, so today we're going to talk about the meaning of the April 8th solar eclipse. So just backing up a little bit, before April, um, I talked about in one of my previous videos how the pattern. So we had these three supermoons in 2019 in the months of January, February, and March. And so I talked about how the patterns were repeated in 2024. We didn't have three supermoons, but we did have a lot of the patterns of the full moons falling on the Jewish holidays were repeated. Um, and so what was interesting, kind of connected to this video, is that in March, the full moon was connected to a lunar eclipse on March 25th. Okay, and I actually didn't make this connection in my last video about March 25th, but that was when they did the UN resolution that was against Israel, that was like forcing them to do a ceasefire. And um, and then I also kind of got the date wrong last time because I put the full moon on the 24th when it really was on the 25th, and that is ended up being on Shushan Purim instead of Purim. And so what's interesting about Shushan Purim, so that's the second day of Purim. And so what's interesting about that is that in 2020, Shushan Purim was when I believe that was 3/11 in 2020, and that was when they declared that COVID was a pandemic. So that was an interesting day in 2020. And so it's interesting to me that we have this UN resolution happening on Shushan Purim this year, because I think, I mean, it could be a sign that God's getting ready to wrap things up. Like this could be kind of the last big sin abiding before God brings judgment. And because basically the United States, they, instead of voting against this resolution, they abstained, okay, and allowed it to stand. And so that was actually similar to when Obama was leaving office. There was UN Resolution 2334, which I believe was against the settlements in Israel. And Obama did the same thing where he abstained. And so that was a picture of like Obama and or America like turning their back on Israel. And so we saw that with this UN resolution. Biden turning his back on Israel. So those are the supermoons. And then I thought, okay, well, it might be helpful to know what happened in April of 2019, following these supermoons. And I didn't see any other like lunar eclipse or anything in April. And I did also check December of 2018 to see if there was like a lunar eclipse or something, but I didn't find anything. But what I did find in April of 2019 was the Notre Dame Fire happened in 2019, in April of 2019, and that happened on April 15th, which was Nissan 10 to 11. So I thought that was interesting because I do kind of think that was a big sign from God. And then, so then this year in April 8th was when we had the solar eclipse. So I definitely believe it was a very big sign from God. And so I brought my picture over from the Notre Dame Fire, and that happened April 15th to 16th in 2019, Nissan 10 to 11. What was interesting about it is that I wondered if it was an 11th month. Like now we could look back at some of these signs and figure out what God might have been saying now that we have more information. And so I definitely think the Notre Dame Fire might have been an 11-month warning about the coronavirus. Because I wrote, because the shutdown started on March 18th. So I don't know if that was because, like, I had the Notre Dame fire from April 15th to the 16th, and then on April 17th, someone tried to set fire to the St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City. And then, like, maybe April 18th would have been 11 months before March 18th. Well, yeah, it would be. I mean, it is. So, um, anyway, so that was kind of interesting. I mean, I definitely think in these signs that God sends, and you got to know how to read the signs. That a lot of times there's more than one message that God's trying to send. Like if he's got our attention, he's probably going to say a lot. So with the Notre Dame fire, so besides being a warning about the coronavirus coming up, I'm not totally sure all that God's trying to say, but we know that Notre Dame means Our Lady, so there could be a connection to America. France has 6 letters in it. The fire happened 6 days before Passover, so that's interesting because then that kind of leads us to this year where, now we're in the time of Passover in April. What happened with the Notre Dame fire is the big spire fell, and then the big 2 towers in the front they survived. And so I don't, I'm kind of wondering if, like, right now Biden's kind of in control, in power, and so I think it's possible that he could fall and then we could return back to like the 2 witnesses. So maybe Netanyahu still has a role to play in the last days, and I definitely believe Trump's coming back and has a role to play in the last days. So that's one thought I had, but we'll see what happens. Excuse me. I also wondered if it was symbolic of the fall in Afghanistan, because the Kabul, so the city of Kabul in Afghanistan fell to the Taliban on August 15, 2021, which was 28 months, 122 weeks after this fire. So, not sure about that. So that's that fire. Okay, and so then the other thing about the supermoons, within 2019 is that, so it was interesting because they were a year before January 2020, where we had the deal of the century from Trump, and then March, like I said before, March 2020 was the COVID shutdown. So March 11th was Shushan Purim, and then, where they declared COVID a pandemic, and then March 18th was when things got shut down in America. So then this year with the solar eclipse, one of the things that stands out, or 2 things that stand out for me with the solar eclipse, is that it happened on April 8th, so I highlighted the 8 because the 8 to me I think is a big deal, and especially because when you take 2024, 2 plus 2 plus 4 equals 8. Okay, but then April 8th also happened on the 2nd of Adar, the 29th of the 2nd of Adar on the Hebrew calendar. And I look at the 29th as a possible, like, you could take that number and make 11 out of it. And so, because the number 29 seems to show up a lot. I mean, I see 9/11 everywhere. But then, so then it, I pay attention to when I see like 29 that adds up to 11. So that's interesting. So, and then what was interesting about it is that it was 7 years after the solar eclipse that we had on August 21st. And so also when in trying to figure out what these eclipses mean, it's helpful to know kind of maybe what God was saying with the other eclipses. And so then I also wrote here, so it happened on April 8th, 2024. And so you could get 488 out of April 8th, 2024. So that's interesting. So I did take a look at the Great American Solar Eclipse that happened on August 21st. Okay, so that has an 8 number connected to it too. It happened in August. Okay. And I saw a lot of connections to Trump with that solar eclipse, because we saw with that solar eclipse, I don't know if you remember, Trump started looking at the eclipse without solar glasses, and someone had to yell at him to put glasses on. And then it's interesting too because this solar eclipse happened in the first year of Trump's presidency. Okay. And then, so then what happened was 108 days after that solar eclipse was when Trump announced that he was moving the embassy. And that was on 12/6/2017, which was Kislev 18. So we definitely see that 18 number, which connects to 666. 12/6 can be parsed out to be 666. So I highlighted the 8, like 108. We see that 8 number there too. Let's see, I highlighted the 1. I don't remember. Oh, because actually too, if you take both those numbers, 1 and 8, 108, you see another 18 there. Okay. So that definitely connects to 666. Okay. And then 8 months, 24 days later was the embassy opening. And so you can get 8888 from 8/24. But I think there's 6s. Like 24 is also 4 6s, I think. Yeah, it is. So that was when the embassy opening happened on the 70th year of Israel. And so, I believe that Trump's like a false messiah, but he's done these signs to deceive people. So God's using Trump to see if you're going to follow the true Messiah or if you're going to follow this false Messiah Trump. Okay, and so he allows Trump to do these signs that deceive people. Okay. And then what we saw 2 years after the Great American Solar Eclipse was on 8/21/2019. That was a really interesting day because Trump, first of all, he retweeted a tweet from someone talking about Trump being like the king of Israel. And then Trump kind of had this rant in front of the reporters about being the chosen one and looked toward the sky. So definitely very interesting. So I definitely think that was, well, and we'll talk about, when we talk about this year's solar eclipse, I'll show you how the solar eclipses are pictures of the false Messiah. So then this year, the solar eclipse on April 8th, we saw that it happened 2 weeks after the UN resolution 2728, which I talked about, that happened on Shushan Purim, that America abstained from voting. We see the 8 and 11 numbers. I mentioned that already. What was interesting is that there was a 4.8 magnitude earthquake in New Jersey 4 days before. So another way that God was like pointing to the solar eclipse, that 4.8. And then it was 4 days before. In 2020, August 4th was the explosion in Lebanon. And that was, I thought we entered into a time that I considered like the fiery furnace in 2020. Because what was interesting in 2020 is, so in May of 2020, it started the BLM rioters, okay? And so that could be a type of lion's den from the book of Daniel. And then with the explosion in Lebanon, then it was kind of followed by, there was a lot of fires in California and stuff that would be a picture of the fiery furnace. Okay. And so I see a repeat now where I believe with the war in Israel, um, that the attack by Hamas is a picture of um, Daniel in the lion's den because they took hostages. They still have hostages. And then the attack by Iran could be considered like the fiery furnace because um, Daniel's three friends actually didn't get hurt by that fiery furnace, and by the grace of God, Israel um, like suffered really minor damage when Iran went to attack um, Israel. So that's interesting. And so we saw that when Iran attacked Israel, that was 6 days after the solar eclipse. Okay. Um, so I definitely see like the solar eclipse connecting to, um, what's happening in Israel. Um, and then 1 week after the solar eclipse was when Trump's trial began. Um, and then what's very fascinating is that Trump did a campaign ad the day before. Um, And so I think I have a picture of that coming up. And then what's interesting about the 2024 solar eclipse is that compared to 2017, there was longer totality and it involved more cities than 2017. Um, and so the totality was over 4 minutes totality in some places. Okay, so we see a repeat of that 4 number too. Okay. Okay, yeah, so here it is. This is the picture of Trump's campaign ad. Um, and so basically, Trump took the imagery from the solar eclipse and he made himself the moon. Okay. Um, well, so to me, that's fascinating because um, um, I have a slide where I talk about this. Let's see, is it coming up? Um, so I think on here, so this is my slide where I talk about, so Trump is the sixth king, and I believe he's going to be returning as the eighth king. And we read in Revelation that the eighth king does destruction. Okay, so it says the beast which was and is not is himself also an eighth and is of the seven, and he goes to destruction. Okay. Um, and then we read about there are 7 kings, 5 is fallen, 1 is, the other has not yet come, and when he comes, he must remain a little while. So I believe that's talking about the 7th king, and I believe that connects to Biden, and I believe he only gets 3.5 years or 42 months, okay, which we're really coming up on the deadline for that, depending on when you start counting. So the election in November 3rd in 2020, 42 months leads us to the first week in May. And then November 7th is another date you can start counting 42 months on. That also leads us to the beginning of May. Um, um, so God talks about shortening the days. So maybe he starts counting the 42 months from either the election or from 11/7. Because if we have to wait till 42 months after the inauguration, that's still quite a ways to go. Okay, so I wrote that if Trump were to return, he would be like the 47th president of America, which adds up to 11, by the way. 47, 4 plus 7 equals 11. And then that would make him the 8th king. Because I started counting the kings from Reagan, okay? And, one of the reasons I did that is because Reagan was 40 years ago. The middle of Reagan's term was 40 years ago. And it's the numbers have worked out really well, with 5 being connected to Obama, 6 to Trump, Biden to 7. Because we see, like I said, Biden became president on 11/7, so that 7 number definitely works for Biden. So this, yeah. So then I talked about this, the solar eclipse being on the 8th. And then you get that 11th number from the 29th. Okay, so in Genesis 1, when God's, creating the world and the universe, he says, "Then God said, let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and they shall serve as signs and for seasons and for days and for years." God made the two great lights, the greater light to govern the day and the lesser light to govern the night. He made the stars also. So it's interesting that Trump made himself the moon in that solar eclipse campaign ad that he did, because I believe the greater light to govern the day, the symbolism of that. So that's the sun, but the symbolism of that is the greater light that governs the day is really the Messiah. Okay, and then there's a lesser light that governs the night. Okay, the darkness, that would be the moon. Okay, and so like I said, I think that connects to Trump, the false Messiah. So we'll get back to this picture. So that's fascinating that he made himself the moon. His shadow is the moon, okay? Because I do believe that that's the symbolism that God is showing in this solar eclipse, okay? So we know that even sometimes donkeys can prophesy, right? So I believe that Trump's prophesying without probably even knowing what he's saying, okay? I mean, most definitely doesn't know what he's saying, okay? I mean, he just, he's narcissistic, so he has to make everything about him. And so then, so what's interesting in the solar eclipse is we see the moon covering the sun's light. Okay, so we have this false Messiah in the world that's blocking Jesus's light. Okay, okay, so then in Revelation 12, so if you understand that the sun represents Jesus and the moon represents a false Messiah like Trump, then Revelation 12:1 makes more sense. When it says, "A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. And she was pregnant, and she cried out, being in labor and in pain to give birth." So the woman was clothed with the sun, so clothed with Messiah. The moon under her feet, so Trump's under her feet, okay? And the feet, to me, that connection goes back to Daniel's statue here, where the last prophetical season we're going to be in connects to the feet of Daniel's statue, okay? And so I think it could, be the battle between MAGA and Joe Biden's followers, okay? Because during the legs of iron, during the time of Trump, we saw that it was, kind of like Trump versus the BLM people. Even though that wasn't much of a war, but there was still a lot of conflict going on there. Oops, what did we do? Oh, okay. And then, so then in Matthew 24, which talks about the last days, we read, "Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky. And then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory." So I believe it's very possible that this solar eclipse is fulfilling verse 30, that the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky. So the Son of Man expression could connect to both the true Messiah and the false Messiah. Okay, and so so the sign of the Son of Man could be a picture of the sign of the false Messiah. But I believe God, his signs are very rich, and so he's a lot of times telling us several things at the same time. And so I think it's giving us a picture of Jesus, but it's also giving us a picture of Trump, okay, in this solar eclipse. I mean, a very active solar eclipse, okay. Um, and then, so then in Luke 23, we read about, okay, so one of the other signs, so if you like are aware of the fact that, okay, so in Luke 23, so remember that when Jesus was crucified, it says, and when they came to the place called the skull, there they crucified him and the criminals, one on the right and the other on the left. And so I believe all throughout scriptures, one of the signs of Jesus is this picture where he's in the middle and there's someone on the right and someone on the left. That picture shows up all throughout the scriptures and in nature and stuff like that too. It shows up all over the place because that's definitely the sign of the true Son of Man. Okay, and so I put here a picture of this would be like Calvary. Jesus on the cross with the criminals on the right and the left. Okay, so if we understand this left and right imagery with the two criminals, we saw that left and right imagery in the solar eclipse because first the moon enters the right side of the sun and it exits the left side. So you get kind of a repeat of the partial sun with like a shadow on the right or a shadow on the left, depending on the phase of the solar eclipse. But you also saw that in the shadows. So I was watching the shadows of the solar eclipse. So before totality, you have these crescent shadows, and they were pointing one direction. And then after totalities, those shadows pointed the opposite direction. I mean, it was just a fascinating picture. That's where you need to take like a calendar or something during the solar eclipse to see these shadows and how they change direction. Okay, so there's this picture of the right and the left on both sides of the totality solar eclipse. Okay, so we're seeing that pattern. Hopefully that makes sense to you. We're seeing that picture in this solar eclipse. Okay. And then what was interesting too is that the Trump Tower. Okay, so this was in 2018. This was before the 3 blood moons, like a year before, or 11 months before. What was interesting is that we had Trump Tower had a fire on the 50th floor, and one person actually died. And so what was interesting, so you kind of see that same, like you see a fire on the right and a fire on the left, and then kind of no fire in the middle, could be connected to, this Calvary picture. And so it was interesting that this blaze broke out on the 50th floor because 50 connects to the gallows that Haman built. Okay. And so what we saw in the story of Esther, we see in the second banquet that Haman gets exposed and he gets killed on the gallows that he built. Okay. So that's what the number 50 connects to. And so we've seen a fulfillment of that with the war in Israel. It started 50 years after, I think it was the Yom Kippur War, was when Israel was attacked by Hamas. Okay, so that connects to the gallows that Haman built. I think I actually have a slide with the verses, so I'll wait for that slide about the book of Esther. And then what was interesting too, so I wrote the third blood moon, the Golan announcement is 1 day shy of 50 weeks after this fire. So that's interesting too, how that third blood moon comes 50 weeks. So we see a repeat of that 50 number. And then, so the date of this is April. It's another April 7th, 2018. And 6 firefighters were injured. So we got that 6 number. It happened on Nisan 22. And so 22 is the number. So when the Jewish people have their festivals, they're they're a lot of times they're 7 days long, and so that happens on um, the 15th through the 21st of the Hebrew month, and then there a lot of times would be an 8th day connected to the festival, which will happen on the 22nd of the Hebrew month. Okay, so Nisan 22. So this is actually the 8th day of Passover. I didn't even make that connection until now, which happens on April 30th this year. Okay, so this could definitely be a really big sign if something, if we do end up seeing God's judgment come on the 8th day of Passover this year. That this could be God pointing to that. Okay. And so this happened 6 years ago. Okay, so a 6-year sign. So what's interesting too is you could take the date 4/7/2018 and add it. 4 plus 7 plus 2018 equals 11 plus 11 equals 22. So another the date is also pointing to 22, which points to the 8th day. Okay, so definitely a big sign. And then also too, if you remember with the solar eclipses, in the middle of the two solar eclipses that were 7 years apart was 12/14/2020 on that date. And so the middle, so Jesus is in the middle. And so a lot of times you want to pay attention to what happens in the middle of things. Okay. And so in the middle of the two solar eclipses was 12/14/2020. And on this day was the first day of the COVID vaccine. Okay. So that happened 12 days after 8/21/17, 2017. So 12 days after the Great American Solar Eclipse. April 9th would actually be 24/24 after the Great American Solar Eclipse. So, that's interesting, a repeat of that 24 number. So it was like something good happened in the middle of the two solar eclipses. We got the vaccine to help us deal with COVID. Then, okay, so let me look at these dates. So 4/22/24. Okay, so then the dates of Passover, what's interesting, so Passover Eve started 4/22 of this month, okay, April 22nd, and so that actually ended up being 80 months, 2 days after the Great American Solar Eclipse, so a repeat of that 8 number in the 80 months, okay. 4/30/24 is actually, which is the 8th day of Passover, is 80 months, 10 days after the Great American Solar Eclipse. Okay, and then the other thing too is we had a solar eclipse. They called it an annular solar eclipse on October 14th of 2023. So my husband was reminding me of this one. And so that's why I said it's important to look at these other solar eclipses to see the connection. Okay. And so what we saw is that eclipse happened on October 14th, which was on Tishri 29. So we see that 29 number again. Okay. And so then that solar eclipse happened 8 days after Israel was attacked on 10/7/23. Okay. So we see that 8 number. And that's kind of depends how you count it, because it could be 7 or 8 days. It depends on if you count the 14th or don't count the 14th. And then the April 8th solar eclipse happened 177 days later. Okay. And then what we saw with this solar eclipse on April 8th is 6 days later, that's when Iran attacked Israel. So there's a connection to Israel getting attacked with the solar eclipses too. Okay. What was interesting about the October solar eclipse and the April solar eclipse is in the middle of those. Okay, so it was like SeaWorld San Antonio was kind of the closest to being in the middle of both of them. Like San Antonio falls in the middle of it. And and it was interesting. I saw a slide that mentioned SeaWorld. Um, and I thought that was interesting because I think people actually went to SeaWorld to see the April 8th solar eclipse. And so I highlighted sea because we know the sea, I believe that Biden is the beast from the sea. So that's interesting to me. But then I guess this is also the area of the Alamo because they, so remember the Alamo. So I think there could be a connection to that. And then they called the solar eclipse in October the Ring of Fire. And I don't have any big ideas of what the Ring of Fire could connect to. Except like maybe if you connect it to the Alamo, like connecting to yeah, well, I mean, especially if you see that these two eclipses connect to like the war in Israel, that could be a picture of what the Ring of Fire, is talking about. And so we're kind of seeing like like the beginning of the war in Israel, and then what I'm hoping is near the end of, the solar eclipse is kind of a picture near the end of the war, with this attack from Iran, or like the second phase of the war. So that could be what the Ring of Fire is about. And then October 14th, if you take 10 plus 14, you get that 24 number. So definitely maybe pointing to 2024. And then 2023 adds up to 7, which I'd talk about that in my video about Biden. Okay, so so it's interesting that these two solar eclipses were both on the 29th on the Hebrew calendar. And then, so then I thought too, we need to talk about the middle of the 17th solar eclipse and the 24th solar eclipse. That in the middle of those, so remember I said you pay attention to the middle, okay? So what was interesting is, so Carbondale, Illinois, they say was kind of in the center of the two eclipses. They call that Little Egypt, okay? So I thought that was interesting because there's definitely a connection to the Passover with Egypt. I thought the Carbon and Carbondale may be kind of connected to, like fire. But what was the kind of the nice thing is Cedar Lake is in Jackson County. It's just south of the Carbondale, is actually the exact point of the center, is what I've read. And so God's people could be like cedars, okay? But then we do read also too, so in Ezekiel 31:3, it says Assyria was a cedar in Lebanon, okay? But then if you read that whole chapter of Ezekiel 31, it talks about that God goes and chops down this cedar in Lebanon. Okay, I definitely think that could connect to Biden. Okay, because it talks about how this cedar in Lebanon is very tall, has lots of power. I don't know if it talks about, it might mention being that Assyria was arrogant. So that could definitely be Biden. And how God always has to cut down arrogant things. Okay, so so this area too in Carbondale, Illinois is a tri-state area. So we see that number 3, which is significant. And then with the solar eclipses being 7 years apart, if you remember in the story of Joseph, he talks about 7 years of famine. Okay, so a lot of people talk about the 7-year. A lot of quote unquote prophets on YouTube talk about the 7 years tribulation to come, and I don't think they recognize that we've been in the 7-year tribulation period. Because what I believe, okay, so in that picture with, so when Joseph is interpreting Pharaoh's dreams, like around Genesis 40. He, Pharaoh has these dreams, and Joseph says there's going to be 7 years of abundance in Egypt, and then it's going to be followed by 7 years of famine. Okay. Well, so what I believe, so you got to understand it's abundance in Egypt. Okay. Not abundance for God's people, but abundance for his enemies. Okay. And so what I believe is the 7 years of abundance in Egypt happened during the time of Obama, because Obama had a lot of power and he was able to manipulate the Middle East the way he wanted to. I mean, he was definitely a pro-Muslim guy, pro-Muslim Brotherhood guy. And, so him and Hillary Clinton, they manipulated the Arab Spring while they were in power. Okay. And then it was followed by 7 years of famine. Okay. And so what I believe that connects to the 4 years of Trump plus the 3 years with Biden. And it's actually going to be like 3.5 years with Biden. Um, and so famine, I mean, it's, it was still a time of famine, even during Trump for God's people. But definitely, during the time of Biden, definitely famine for God's people. But then there was also like during the time of Trump, it was a time of famine for like Obama and Biden and their followers. Okay. That's why they wanted to get rid of Trump. Okay. So anyways, and so the final 3 year period during Biden, has definitely been difficult for God's people. And okay, so like I said, these two solar eclipses are definitely pointing to the two parts of the war in Israel. And that connects to the two banquets in the book of Esther. Okay. And then so let's talk about Esther. So at the first banquet of Esther, Esther said, "If it pleases the king, may the king and Haman come this day to the banquet that I prepared for him." Then the king said, "Bring Haman quickly, so that we may do as Esther desires." So the king and Haman came to the banquet which Esther had prepared. So so what that connects to is, so if you have Esther being a picture of Biden, let's see, is that how it works? May the king and Haman come this day to the banquet that I have prepared. It connects to, okay, so the first banquet of Esther connects to the Saudi deal that Biden was trying to put together. And that Saudi deal ended up causing this war in Israel. Okay. And so, so Esther says, "Let the king and Haman come this day to the banquet that I have prepared." So that could be a picture of Biden, trying to get the Saudi king, and let me think. They were trying to make a Saudi deal, and then it says, "Bring Haman quickly." And so how God says when they're saying peace and safety, then sudden destruction. So Haman came quickly. The attack on Israel came quickly after Biden and Netanyahu too. So yeah, so Netanyahu's in there. I mean, maybe Netanyahu's the king, and Haman could be the Saudis in the first part of that, but then when it says bring Haman quickly, that connects to Hamas. Okay. So the king and Haman came to the banquet which Esther had prepared. So the first banquet is the war in Israel. As they drank their wine at the banquet, the king said to Esther, "What is your request? For it shall be granted to you. And what is your wish? Up to half the kingdom it shall be done." So if the king is Netanyahu and Esther is Biden, Netanyahu is, trying to please Biden, okay, during this war. Okay, so Netanyahu does what Biden wishes during the war. Okay, so then we see that Haman builds the gallows. Okay, so I talked about this. Um, okay, in the morning, ask the king to have Mordecai hung on the gallows, then go joyfully with the king to the banquet. And the advice pleased Haman, so he had the wooden gallows built. Okay, so so have a wooden gallows 50 cubits high made. Okay, so we saw that this attack on Israel happened in the morning. It was 50 years after the Yom Kippur War. Um, and so that's a picture of Haman's gallows. Okay. Then we read about the second banquet of Esther. And that's when we saw Haman exposed. Okay, so now the king and Haman came to drink wine with Esther the queen. And Esther said, "A foe and an enemy is this wicked Haman." Then Haman became terrified before the king and queen. So Iran was exposed for who they really are when they attacked Israel on 4/13/24. Okay, so that's the second banquet, the second part of this war. Okay, but then we saw like Haman falls on Esther's couch. So then we saw that American forces were attacked in Syria on 4/21/24 by Iranian proxies. Okay. And then in Esther, it goes on to say that Haman is hung on the 50-foot gallows that he built for Mordecai. And so I believe that's a picture of Biden's time coming to an end. He caused this war to happen in Israel, and so then God's going to bring judgment. So I'm going to check, make sure that it was 50 years, yeah, after the Yom Kippur War. I wanted to make sure I was saying the right thing. Okay. So I think it is possible that the solar eclipse is pointing to the 8th day of Passover, which is April 30th, which actually the 8th day starts on the evening of the 29th of April. So there's that 29 number. Because you know how the Jewish holidays always start the evening before. So what's interesting about Passover, it starts on 4/22 and the 8th day of Passover is on Nisan 22. So it's like Passover starts with the number 8, that 22 number, which connects to 8, and then it ends on that 22 number, so lots of connections to the number 8. But I definitely think the solar eclipse is pointing to the 8th king, which, like I said, is Trump. I believe is Trump. So this is the list that has, Trump's 6-piece deals, and then August 9th is when they were talking about the Saudi deal. So what's interesting is that okay, so in the little box I wrote 8/8/22 was when they seized 11 sets of documents at Mar-a-Lago. So I didn't even realize it till I typed it into this video, into these slides, that it's 8/8/22. Remember I said 22 is another way of saying 8, so it's like 8/8/8 was that the Mar-a-Lago warrant. So that was interesting, just looking at other 8/8 or other 8 dates. Okay. And then what was interesting too is that 8/8/23 was the Maui fire. Okay. That was the day before they announced in the Wall Street Journal about President Biden's Saudi deal. Okay, so I definitely think that was judgment for the Saudi deal. Okay. Like God shortening the time, we're seeing judgment sometimes before things happen. So definitely other connections to 8. And so one thing that I wanted to say about the Maui fire is that sometimes when God sends a sign, it gets kind of explained away. Like we got global warming is explaining away some of the judgments that God is sending. And so that comes from people on the left. Well, then I hear conspiracy theories about people on the right. And so some of the people on the right think that there was, some conspiracy behind the Maui fire when it was just dry conditions and really bad weather conditions that blew that fire around. Okay. Um, you know, so when you understand that God is the one controlling the weather, and man cannot control the weather, only God can. Um, um, those are man-centered. A lot of these conspiracy theories and global warming too are man-centered beliefs. Okay, that it's giving man too much power and taking away God's power. So just wanted to say that. And then so then I talked about this in one of my previous videos, was Biden's administration, his actions during the war. And, so, I'll just point out that he did that ceasefire to get the hostages returned. I think that's the covenant with many that we read about in Daniel 9. And then since I talked about these in my previous videos, I'll skip to, I'll emphasize this, that Biden, Blinken got together 9 Arab countries to work together. Okay, Arab nations will partner with the U.S. on Gaza if Israel gets on board. Okay, what they're looking for is to establish an independent Palestinian state. So this could be the 10 heads of the beast from the sea. And then, so let's see, I already talked about all these, but I added, this is new stuff that I added. So in March, so I had already talked about the beginning of March, and then on March 9th, we had Biden says Netanyahu is hurting Israel by not preventing more civilian deaths in Gaza and says Rafah is a red line. On March 13th, Biden extended a $10 billion waiver for Iran. On March 14th was when we saw Chuck Schumer calling for new elections in Israel. Oh, I didn't get the dates in here of when, because Gantz came and met with the Biden administration. Benny Gantz is kind of Netanyahu's opponent in Israel. And so I think there could have been some under the table dealings with Gantz. Definitely Biden's administration likes Gantz so much better because he's on the left politically. They do not like Netanyahu. Biden's trying to get a 2-state solution, and Netanyahu is against that. And so, so we saw on March 14th, we saw Chuck Schumer calling for new elections, and then Gantz came out, and I didn't get that date down, so I'm making a note for myself to make sure to add that for my next video, if I do a next video. But then we saw on March 18th was a Biden and Netanyahu phone call after a month pause. And they had dispute over the Rafah operation, which could be why it's been slow to happen. Okay. On March 22nd, the U.S. tried and failed to pass the UN Security Council calling for immediate ceasefire. On March 24th, Vice President Harris says consequences for Israel if they go into Rafah. On March 25th, the U.S. abstained on UN Resolution 2728. On March 26th, so I put this in here because that's the judgment, quick judgment for this UN resolution. The Francis Scott Key Bridge collapsed. 6 killed, 2 injured. What was interesting about that bridge collapse too was that, so we see that number 8 with the 6 killed and the 2 injured. It happened on March 26th, so 22 plus 6 for 26 adds up to 8. What's interesting about that bridge is it cut off like a key port for America. And we saw in okay, so I backed up on March 7th. Biden had his State of the Union, and he talked about building a temporary pier in Gaza to bring aid to the Palestinians. So it's interesting that God brings judgment by cutting off one of our ports. Okay, so Biden wanted to build a port in Israel, and then our port gets affected. Okay, and so then moving into April 4th was another Biden and Bibi phone call. Biden was outraged by the 4-2 accident. That was when Israel accidentally killed 7 aid workers. Okay, Biden was really ticked off. Okay, and no one recognizes that. Well, first of all, it's kind of dumb that you have. I mean, this is just a really bizarre war, and that you have aid coming in while they're trying to fight a war, and we have Hamas trying to use the Palestinians as human shields. And so accidents are going to happen, especially if aid workers, just aren't being safe, staying out of the way. So there's a bigger picture to look at instead of just blaming Israel and accusing them of genocide and all that anti-Semitic beliefs about it. I think they should have left Israel alone. The war could have maybe been over by now if they had just left Israel alone and Israel was able to go in and do what they needed to do and get it over with. So, anyways, so then on April 14th, the G7 met to discuss Israel. I think that might have been prompted by this 4-2 accident. And then the UN Security Council also met at the same time. April 24th. Okay, so then on April 24th was when Biden signs the aid bill for Israel, and that included aid for Ukraine and Taiwan. So this is where, how does God deal with Biden? Because sometimes he does good things for Israel. And so that's why I connect him to Laodicea. He's a mixture of the hot and cold waters that become lukewarm that God wants to spit out of his mouth. Okay. And then on April 16th, I got my dates reversed here. Biden plus 17 nations call on Hamas to make a hostage deal. Okay. I wonder if I have the right date. That could be April 26th. So, because I know it happened, I think that's supposed to be April 26th. So Biden plus 17 nations call on Hamas to make a hostage deal. So I thought that was cool that happened during Passover, because that's a picture of Moses and Aaron saying, "Let my people go" during Passover. And actually it's funny because Moses always gets the credit for saying, "Let my people go." But it's Moses, if you actually read the scriptures, it's Moses and Aaron saying, "God says, let my people go." But Moses always gets the credit. So, and then, I finally figured out that time times and half a time connects to 3.5 years of Biden. Okay. And like I said, we're approaching that. Okay. And so I won't talk about this because I think I talked about this in my last video, and I don't think I made any changes. But we see that time times and half a time is kind of the end. And then it says all these events. It said, and swore by him who lives forever that it would be for a time and half a time. And as soon as they finish shattering the power of the holy people, all these events will be completed. So shattering the power of the holy people, we've definitely seen how Biden has put enough pressure on Israel to kind of take away their power during this war. And then now in America, we see, with the protesters at the schools and the immigration problem in America, that God's people in America are definitely oppressed in America. So here's some other verses that mention time, times, and half a time. So you can read those if you'd like. I thought also too that in Revelation 11:9, where we read about looking at the dead bodies of the two witnesses for 3.5 days, could connect to those 3.5 years of Biden. So we definitely know during the time of Biden that, Trump is dead in a way. He doesn't have power during Biden. And then even though Netanyahu is in power, we still see him being dead in a way, with Biden taking away his power and putting pressure on him to do things the way Biden wants. And so, like I said, Biden is the beast from the sea with the 10 heads. I kind of wonder now with the 10 heads. The beast from the sea actually has 10 heads and 10 horns and 7 heads. I've seen kind of like 3 different things that could be the 10 heads. We saw like I said on that article, January 2024, Blinken meets with 9 nations. That could be the beast with 10 heads. So 9 Arab nations plus U.S. pushing Israel into a 2-state solution. Or we could have the 10 nations that were fighting with Houthi rebels under the U.S. Task Force 153 in the Red Sea. That was pronounced by Lloyd Austin on 12/18/23 after having a press conference in Tel Aviv with Gallant and mentioning 2-state solution. Exactly 2 weeks later, Austin was admitted into the hospital for complications after prostate surgery. So you got to be careful if you're going to be pushing a 2-state solution. I also wonder too if it's connected to, remember I said that the 17 nations along with Biden, the 17 could connect to the 10 horns and the 7 heads, okay, that are calling on Hamas to make a hostage deal. So there could be multiple fulfillments, okay. And then I also had mentioned G7 for the 7 heads. Because we see Biden doing a lot with G7, okay. And then I wanted to talk about other 22 connections. And 22 and then the number 8 too. So the 8th day is the day of circumcision. Okay, so there's a cutting that happens on the 8th day, a removal of flesh on the 8th day. Okay, and like I said, the 22nd is the 8th day of Jewish holidays. 22 is connected to the war with Hamas. October 7th was Tishri 22. The ground invasion was on day 22. Israel votes to accept hostage deal on November 22nd. And then right before the solar eclipse, there was a woman, maybe a basketball player, that was number 22 that won, like her team won some great, they won something, like championship or something like that. I don't have the details, sorry. And then April 30th, so this was fascinating to me too. April 30th is actually 222 weeks from the deal of the century. And then it's also 322 days from Trump's birthday. And then it's 8 months, 22 days from the Saudi deal. Okay. And then it's actually, okay, so this doesn't connect to 22, but I thought this was significant. It's April 30th is actually 40 days from Biden's UN resolution on 3/22. So interesting that he tried to do that UN resolution on the 22nd. And so that could be, April 30th could be the 40th day that we're all looking for. That when judgment comes, 40 days, okay? On 4/24/24, Biden voted on a bill that will ban TikTok. Okay, so it's interesting that we're talking about TikTok and banning TikTok, because I think that's a picture of we're out of time. Okay, and so 4/24/24, I think was the middle of Passover. Let me look. No, it's actually the second day of Passover. But what happened? So I think it was the Let My People Go on the 26th, the Biden plus the 17 nations. That's actually that was the fourth day of Passover, so the middle of Passover. Um, so oh yeah, so like I said, I always pay attention to the middle stuff. Okay, so let my people go. So that's why I'm thinking this Passover could be really significant. Um, so I was thinking of, by the grace of God, I might try to do a video on Passover. Um, so, anyways, okay, so there we go. That's what I got for you. The meaning of the April 8th solar eclipse. There's so much going on and so much that could be talked about. So many connections to the scripture. So don't be like those people that don't pay attention to things God's trying to say, because we want to listen to God and we want to hear what he might be trying to say. So I really thank you for tuning in. So hang in there. I really think time is short, like TikTok time is short. And so so I pray that God gives you the grace to make it through. I think we're really close. I mean, if it doesn't happen, if we don't see anything on the 29th or the 30th, the 29th or the 30th, that could be another pointer to um you know what's to come. Okay, but I definitely think, I mean, I know we're in the year of the eighth king, and so this Passover is definitely another picture of the eighth king. The solar eclipse is definitely a picture of the eighth king. So Trump's in court right now too, and that's a picture of, during Holy Week, when Jesus was alive, we saw like Jesus's trial. Okay, well, I think Trump's trial is fulfilling the prophecies from Jesus's trial. Okay, so there's a lot of stuff that happened that Holy Week when Jesus was on earth that's being fulfilled in our day, and so Trump's trial is one of them. Oh, and I don't remember if I finished my thought about Gantz, but Gantz came, and so and came and talked to the Biden administration, and so I think that could be the fulfillment of Judas betraying Jesus. Okay, so Biden is betraying Netanyahu by trying to make a deal with Gantz. Um, so yeah, so a lot is being fulfilled. So okay, so I'll wrap it up for now. Thank you so much for tuning in. God bless. Take care.